Welcome, everyone. If you came here to hear from Dr. Don Murphy about China's rise in the Global South, you're in the right Zoom room. This event is organized and hosted by the Africa-China Initiative, or ACI. ACI is a relatively new initiative here at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Institutionally, we are hosted by the African and Asian Studies programs and funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. This event is co-sponsored by Georgetown's Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues and the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Yoonjung Park, and I'm the Program Director of ACI. I also teach in African Studies here, and I serve as Executive Director of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. I'm so pleased to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Don Murphy. Dr. Murphy is an associate professor of national security strategy at the U.S. National War College, specializing in Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics, U.S.-China relations, and international relations. Her research analyzes China's interests and behavior as a rising global power towards the existing international order. Today, she will speak to us from her new book, China's Rise in the Global South, the Middle East, Africa, and Beijing's Alternative World Order. In it, she analyzes China's foreign policy approach towards the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa regionally, and through detailed case studies of the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the China Middle East Issues Special Envoy, and other such initiatives. Also with us today as discussants are Evan Medeiros and Obert Hudzi. Dr. Hudzi is a lecturer in politics at the University of Liverpool in the UK. His research focuses on the politics of human rights and development and non-Western emerging powers in global governance with empirical expertise in China and Africa. He is the author of the book, The End of China's Non-Intervention Policy in Africa. Dr. Hudzi is also the new chair of the executive board of the Chinese in Africa, Africans in China Research Network. Dr. Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service and the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies. His research and teaching focuses on international politics of East Asia, U.S.-China relations, and China's foreign and national security policies. He's published several books and articles and regularly provides advice to global corporations and commentary to the international media. He previously served for 6 years on the staff of the National Security Council as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Asia. Before I hand over to Dr. Murphy, just a brief rundown of the program. Our events usually last about 90 minutes. Dr. Murphy will speak for about 30. She'll be followed by Dr. Medeiros and Dr. Hudzi, who will each have about 10 to 12 minutes to respond to Dr. Murphy's book talk. We will then hopefully have enough time for at least 2 rounds of questions. Please type your questions into the Q&A box below on the Zoom and not in the chat. I will then read a selection of these to our speakers for their responses. Please indicate to whom your question is addressed and please be as brief as possible. Finally, in case we lose some of you before the very end of the program, I wanted to say thank you to my colleagues without whom this event could not have taken place. Professor Laura Smith and Martha Manzano of African Studies, Professor Yuki Tajima, Annalise Burke, and Robert Lyons of Asian Studies, Susan Douglas at the Center for Contemporary Asian Studies, and Dr. Tom Banshoff, Toya Wulan, and Eleanor Albert of the U.S.-China Dialogue. And of course, the Henry Luce Foundation for their generous support. With that, let me hand over to Don. Thank you, Don, again for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. I should start with my disclaimer that today the views I express are my own and they do not represent the National War College, Department of Defense, or the US government. The overall argument of the book is that although China does not seek to change the international distribution of territory in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, as its power grows, it increasingly competes with the US, builds spheres of influence in these regions, and challenges the rules of the international system by constructing an alternative international order to facilitate interactions. China does not yet seek to replace the existing international order, but if the current order unravels or excludes China, this alternative order could serve as the foundation of China's economic, political, and military relations with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as with the rest of the developing world. The book answers the following questions. What are China's interests in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa? Is China competing or cooperating with the US in these regions? Is China's behavior converging or diverging with the liberal international order? Is China building an alternative international order? And if yes, what are the characteristics of that order? How does China portray itself as a great power in these regions? And ultimately, what does this behavior in these regions indicate about China's rise globally? So before I really dive into the talk, I want to give a few definitions. When I talk about the Middle East, I'm referring to the broader Middle East, including the League of Arab States with North Africa, as well as Iran, Israel, and Turkey. And when I talk about Sub-Saharan Africa, I'm talking about the rest of the continent minus North Africa. I'm not using the terms revisionist or status quo in my work, but for each foreign policy tool examined, I categorize foreign policy behavior as either competitive or cooperative with the US and convergent or divergent with the liberal order. And this morning, I won't get into a detailed description of what the liberal international order is, but I would say for each specific foreign policy tool examined, there are different elements of that order, and I would be happy in Q&A to discuss that more. The overall findings of the book are that as China's power grows, it's competing in the functional areas of economics and politics, and its behavior often, but not always, diverges from the liberal international order. In contrast, in the security realm, China is cooperating, and its behavior is mostly converging with the liberal order. Also, as China's perception of threat from the US increases, its competitive and norm divergent behavior is amplified. So now I want to briefly discuss what China's interests are in these regions, some of the foreign policy tools that I examine in the book with a particular emphasis on cooperation forums and special envoys. And then I'll say a few words about how China portrays itself in these regions. And finally, some conclusions based on this more broadly about China's behavior. So China's interests in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. First, it wants to acquire resources and markets to fuel China's own economic growth. And I do think it's really important, obviously there's a lot of emphasis on resource needs, but I would say that desire for markets for goods and services in this region is just as important to China as acquiring natural resources. China's next interest is fostering support for itself in the international system during an era of emerging multipolarity or bipolarity. And we could discuss that in the Q&A, but regardless of the characteristics of that system, China wants support from the 53 countries on the continent of Africa that recognize it and the countries in the Middle East, in the United Nations, in the World Trade Organization, in the G20, in many different configurations, but these states are very important to them in those forums. Next, China wants to ensure its own domestic stability, and in particular, Xinjiang is in this issue. So China seeks, especially with Arab states and with Muslim majority states, to have relative silence from these states regarding its behavior in Xinjiang. And this will come up a few times in the presentation. China's next interest is advocating for developing country causes, and this ties back to a very long history going into the Mao era even, of China seeing itself as the leader of the third world, of the developing world, of the global south, and seeing itself as an advocate for states within these regions more broadly. China also wants to safeguard its citizens and businesses abroad. This has been a growing concern, especially over the last 10 years. If you think about Libya in 2011, when China had to evacuate out 35,000 of its citizens, it also had similar situations in Yemen and Syria and in other conflict scenarios. Chinese citizens increasingly have been the target of terrorist activities and kidnapping and other threats to their safety. So this is increasingly an interest. And finally, China is wanting to protect its own territorial integrity and sovereignty from the US by gaining support from these countries. So what I mean by this is before 2010, I think arguably China looked at regions, whether it was the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa or Asia, Latin America, looked at them in isolation in certain ways in their relations. But increasingly, it's seeking support from countries in the Middle East and Africa for its stance on the South China Sea, for its behavior in relation to Hong Kong. And although having recognition of the PRC versus Taiwan has been an important element of Chinese foreign policy for many decades, it also increasingly seeks the support of these states to continue to advocate for it on behalf of that issue. So now I'm going to talk about the foreign policy tools that I examine in the book. The first one that I look at is cooperation forums. So I look at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which has 53 states. So that's every state on the continent of Africa minus Eswatini that continues to recognize Taiwan. And that forum meets every 3 years. Its last meeting was in 2021 during COVID. Another cooperation forum I examine is the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum. Established in 2004, this includes all of the League of Arab States. So it also includes North Africa, both of these forums do, and it meets every 2 years. Its last meeting was in December this year. That was held in Saudi Arabia, and I would note that the last meeting of this forum was held at the summit level. Previously, all of the meetings had been at the ministerial level. So these two cooperation forums are the primary multilateral coordination mechanisms that China uses with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And they cover a broad range of issues in the economic, political, security, foreign aid, et cetera, realm. I would note for you, I'm not going to discuss this in depth, but there are many other types of cooperation that are encompassed in these forums, in the environment and education and health and a wide range of other issues. The political norms underlying these cooperation forums are the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So the way to think about that is a very strict interpretation of Westphalian sovereignty. Another important norm is South-South cooperation, as well as in the China-Arab States Cooperation Forum, there is an aspect of China demonstrating support for the Palestinians. And I should note here that for those of you that look at the Mao era, obviously, back during the Mao era, China was providing material support to various Palestinian groups. Since 1992, China has recognized Israel and has strong relations with both Arab states and Israel and other countries in the region. But Arab states continue to want China to demonstrate support for the Palestinians in various ways. So this is an important element of those forums. And as I mentioned earlier, the Arab states being relatively silent about China's behavior in Xinjiang is also a political dynamic. On the economic front, the norms that underlie these forums are heavy state involvement in trade, investment, infrastructure, in contrast with the liberal order that emphasizes free markets and limited state intervention. Another element under these cooperation forums is foreign aid. I'm assuming many of you are familiar with China's foreign aid approach in these regions, but essentially it does not have political conditionality other than recognizing the PRC, but there is a great deal of economic conditionality requiring Chinese firms to be used in various foreign aid contracts. On the security front, that's a limited part of these forums, but when it is emphasized as an issue, there is a desire to have peacekeeping operations, nuclear-free zones in these regions, increased counterterrorism cooperation. So those are the types of issues that are covered. I do want to say a few words about these forums in contrast with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that many of you may already be familiar with. The SCO is a cooperation forum also that was established in 2001 that includes China, Russia, as well as Central Asian states, and India and Pakistan. Over time, it has been expanding to also include Middle Eastern countries. So in 2022, Iran became a formal member, and Turkey has started the process of becoming a full-fledged member. In 2022, you also had a number of states in the region become dialogue partners. Those were Saudi, Egypt, and Qatar. And in 2022, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates have started the process of becoming dialogue partners. So increasingly, this forum is encompassing more and more of the Middle East. And as many of you are aware, in September this last year was the last meeting of that forum. It meets every year as opposed to every 2 or 3 years. And it originally was formed on security issues, but has become over time more involved in the economic and political realm. The next foreign policy tool I want to highlight for you are China's special envoys. The purpose of these envoys are for China to contribute to peace and security in these regions and address what it sees as hotspots. There are 4 that it has established over time in the Middle East and Africa. So the first was established in 2002, and it is the Special Envoy for Middle East Issues. Since its beginning, it is focused on the Middle East peace process and attempting to contribute to the Palestinian-Israeli and broader Arab-Israeli conflict. I won't say a lot about that. I'm assuming the audience is fairly familiar with that issue, but in Q&A, if you're interested, we can talk more about the details regarding its involvement. But that was the purpose from the beginning. The next special envoy that it established was the Special Envoy for Africa Issues in 2007. Originally, this envoy was meant to contribute to a resolution of Darfur and contributing to that issue, but increasingly over time, it's changed its focus, where in the early 2010s, it was working quite strongly in dealing with South Sudan issues after South Sudan separated from Sudan more broadly. And all of these special envoys include many other elements of China's interaction with these regions, but the Africa one has focused on those 2 issues in particular. The next special envoy that China established was for Syria in 2016. And I am going to say a few more words about that, because I assume the audience may not be as familiar with why China wanted to be involved in this particular issue. So China was concerned that the Syrian civil war could spill over into the broader Middle East and endanger the stability and China's access to resources more broadly. It wanted to demonstrate it was a responsible power. And the reason I frame it in this way is if you think back to 2012, when you had the double vetoes between China and Russia on the UN Security Council in relation to Syria, there was quite a bit of concern from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and a number of Arab countries about the stance China was taking. So establishing the special envoy was an opportunity for China to demonstrate that it was interested in resolution of the conflict. It just didn't want to use UN Security Council resolutions as a way to contribute to that. Another driver of establishing the special envoy is that the Turkestan Islamic Party in Syria, which is an insurgency group, part of that civil war, China is concerned about material support from that group coming into Xinjiang and supporting Uyghurs. Another interest of China is contributing to humanitarian assistance and in the longer term reconstruction of the country. And I should note that this special envoy has participated in many different mechanisms that have sought to resolve the conflict, whether that was the Geneva process, Astana, Vienna, etc. And finally, this isn't talked about in the book because it occurred after the book came out, but in early 2022, China established a special envoy for the Horn of Africa. So that one has just started. Next, I want to say a few brief words about other foreign policy tools that China has used in the economic, political, and security realm. So for economics, I think many of you are aware of Chinese state support for its companies, and that in these regions in particular, you have a number of state-owned enterprises because of the sectors that are involved, as well as I mentioned earlier, foreign aid. But one thing you may not be as familiar with is that China's been using a number of other foreign policy tools in the economic realm. One is special economic zones. And what this is if you think about China's own economic development using this model, what they're trying to do in these countries is they provide the seed money for an industrial zone. The purpose of that zone is to attract small and medium-sized Chinese companies to establish operations there, and that in the longer term, you would have spillover effects into the broader economy with skills being gained, as well as opportunities for these Chinese businesses. And those special economic zones have been established in Algeria, Djibouti, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mauritius, Nigeria, Oman, and Zambia. So in a number of countries. Another economic foreign policy tool that China utilizes is free trade agreements. So it has already signed one with Mauritius. It is in negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council. Those negotiations have been in process since 2004. During Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about some of the roadblocks to that, but they have been actively pursuing that with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is the Arab Gulf states. They are also pursuing a free trade agreement with Israel and Palestine. So this is another example of them attempting to show they're a balanced actor between those two entities. China has also expressed interest in pursuing a free trade agreement with the African Continental Free Trade Area, which encompasses the entire continent of Africa. Another economic tool that China uses is called agricultural demonstration centers. These, I'm not going to list off all the countries. There's many different countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where these have been set up. And essentially, this is a center that's focused on a particular crop or other agricultural product. So it could be corn or soy, rice, fisheries, etc. China helped set up the center, which the idea is to create capability to build capacity in the country around that particular crop, but also to provide opportunities for Chinese agribusinesses, particularly at the provincial level, to establish market shares in these various countries. Now, switching gears to the political side, I do want to highlight two aspects of political behavior. So one is in UN Security Council voting. So one thing I look at is the difference in votes between the US and China on the UN Security Council in the post-Cold War era. And in these regions, there's really only two areas where you have different votes. One is around sovereignty, and this ties in with a very longstanding Chinese stance of concerns about sanctions and other violations of sovereignty. The other issue that you have a difference of votes on is regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And it really depends on what the resolution is, whether China's voting yes and the US no, or vice versa, but you do see that divergence. Another foreign policy tool that is examined are strategic partnerships. And I do want to note these strategic partnerships, they aren't alliances, they aren't defense treaties, they aren't formal in that way, but what they are is an expression that China and the country that they establish it with want to have a robust economic and political and potentially security aspects to their relationship. What I want to note for you is that in the Middle East, China has established strategic partnerships with every major country minus Israel. So they have them with Iran and Saudi and UAE and Turkey and Qatar and the Emirates, Egypt, etc. In sub-Saharan Africa, they have established them with all of the major anchor countries and an increasing number of countries throughout the region. I would note for you that since 2015, you have had an uptick in these. So that could be associated with Belt and Road. It also could be that it's a tool that Xi Jinping was wanting to use in various ways. So that's strategic partnerships. In the military realm, I would highlight a few aspects of China's behavior, and these are the predominant military activities China has engaged in the time frame that I examined. So one is United Nations peacekeeping operations. They've engaged in these since 1992, but over time, increasingly, China has been involved in many different missions in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. Another behavior is conventional arms sales. When you look in aggregate over these regions over time, really the only time period that you see a real uptick in conventional arms sales was during the 1980s, when China was selling weapons to both Iran and Iraq in that war. Otherwise, the numbers have remained quite low. Another aspect of China's military behavior has been its involvement in anti-piracy activities off the Gulf of Aden since 2008 in a multilateral fashion. And finally, China did establish a base in Djibouti in 2017. And as many of you are, I'm sure, are aware, that before this base was established, China had technically a no overseas basing policy that Djibouti was its first declared overseas base. Of course, China's behavior in the South China Sea with militarization of various features, some of those have very base-like qualities, but this was its first declared base. And I won't go into a lot of detail now, but happy to talk in Q&A. But some of the drivers of establishing this base were being able to support the evacuation of Chinese citizens in situations like Libya, wanting to further contribute to anti-piracy, wanting to be able to have the ability in the future to protect the sea lanes of communication that go through that area, and broader economic interests in Africa and that particular part of Africa. Today, I'm not saying a lot about Belt and Road, but what I would note for you is that the way that I conceptualize Belt and Road in my own work is that when it was first established, obviously the initial elements of it as far as a land belt and a maritime road in 2013, and then when it was officially announced as Belt and Road in 2015, the original geographic scope included Africa, Asia, and Europe. And from a Chinese conceptualization, the Middle East is part of Asia and Africa. So it encompasses regions from the beginning. I see it very much as an initiative that encompasses all of these regions, right? Not necessarily one country or another, and that it's focused on various types of connectivity more broadly, which, as you all know, increasingly, there's not just a focus on infrastructure, but various types of health cooperation, space cooperation, digital cooperation, green cooperation, etc. And all of the foreign policy tools that I've discussed in my presentation today fall under Belt and Road, either formally or informally, from a conceptualization, but also the way that it's portrayed in official documents. So what I want to say next is to give you an idea on the mapping as far as competition and cooperation, convergence and divergence. I don't have time today to go into each foreign policy tool, but as I said earlier in the presentation, when you look at all of these foreign policies that I just described, you have a real difference by functional area. That in general, the economic and political and foreign aid elements are competitive with the US. Some converge with the liberal order, but most of them diverge. And when I say some converge, some examples of that would be the free trade agreements that China is pursuing, for example. Then on the security front, as I discussed earlier, China's behavior's mostly been cooperative and it's converged with the liberal order. So participating in UN peacekeeping or supporting UN involvement in negotiations, various other multilateral mechanisms, it very much squarely falls in support of the liberal international order. I next want to say a few words about how China portrays itself as a great power in these regions using these tools. So it portrays itself as a defender of sovereignty, a champion of development and South-South cooperation, a promoter of connectivity, an advocate for multilateral institutions. It characterizes itself as a balanced actor that has positive relations with every country in the Middle East, as well as every country in Africa, minus Eswatini, that continues to recognize Taiwan. And it often emphasizes its lack of a colonial history in these regions, especially in comparison with Western powers. So in conclusion, I've tried to give you a feel for what China's interests are in these regions, the foreign policy tools that it uses to pursue those interests, and how it portrays itself as a great power. So I want to say a few words now about what the findings of this book indicate potentially about China's rise globally. So first, China in these regions is not attempting to maximize its power, but it's also not entirely socializing into the liberal international order. and its behavior varies across functional areas in the ways that I've already described. China is also building significant multilateral mechanisms in these regions, especially cooperation forums. And if you look outside of these regions to other parts of the world in the global south that are outside of China's territorial perimeter, its behavior is very similar. So it's established cooperation forums with Latin American states, with Central European states, with Portuguese-speaking states, et cetera. Right? So, and these other foreign policy tools I described, free trade agreements, et cetera, they're pursuing more globally. So I think it gives you an idea of, in the global south, outside their territorial perimeter, the way in which China is behaving as a great power. So I just want to say thank you now. I very much look forward to Evan and Obert's comments. Thank you.
Dawn, thank you so much for that. I'm going to go first to Evan.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Dawn, congratulations. It's a fantastic book. I haven't quite finished reading it yet, but the parts of it that I've read are incredibly impressive. I highly recommend this to everybody joining us today. Not only is China's relationship with the developing world a very, very important issue in the study of Chinese foreign policy. It's absolutely one of the cutting edge issues. It's also increasingly important to questions of broader global order, given the new era that we're in. And one of the great strengths of Dawn's book is the comparative nature of it. Of course, she compares the Middle East and Africa. That's obvious and very, very well done. But she also compares functional areas, the different tools, economic tools, political tools, military tools, etc. So you sort of have both a regional and a functional comparison, which analytically is a very, very powerful approach because it reveals all sorts of interesting insights about what China's doing and how effective it is. So Dawn, congratulations. It's a really, really wonderful piece of work, and it's perfectly timed. As a discussant, I want to sort of raise some questions, and none of these questions are, are criticisms or critiques or really anything like that. It's for me, it's much more about, trying to better understand the nature of China's interactions with the developing world. So the first point I want to make, and it's very much a question for Dawn, is that the world we inhabit now, international politics has changed a lot in the last year or 2 years. And knowing the cycles for books, Dawn undoubtedly wrote this book, many years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the 20th Party Congress, right? The intensification of the US-China strategic competition, and then broader trends in international affairs like the trend toward deglobalization or the economic fragmentation. And all of these events, Ukraine, the 20th Party Congress, deglobalization, US-China strategic competition, all of these are going to influence, already are influencing China's relationship with the developing world. And so I'd love to hear from Dawn about how she thinks these events are affecting China's relationship with the developing world. How is it evolving? I would say at sort of first glance, a sort of hot take would be that the developing world has just become a lot more important to China, right? And frankly, if you read what Xi Jinping has been saying in the past 12 months, including, most recently at events like in 2022, China hosted the BRICS summit, you have China, Xi Jinping really leaning into the importance of the developing world, which I think further validates Dawn's very good argument that the Chinese do look at the developing world as a sphere of influence of sort and a key part of global order, or I should say, a key part of international affairs that will help China to balance US power, or at least that's, how the Chinese are looking at the developing world. But I'd love to hear from Dawn a little bit about since she completed the book, which was undoubtedly, 12 to 18 months ago, big things have happened in China and US-China, and of course in global affairs, and how she thinks that's affecting China's relationship with the developing world. Secondly, a question that naturally flows from Dawn's excellent presentation is how has China done achieving its interest on? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. So it's very clear that China is both present and active in the Middle East and Africa. And the book does a great job of enumerating the arrows in the quiver. But the question is have the Chinese really been able to achieve all the economic, political, security interests? And in particular, are there areas, Dawn, where the Chinese have applied a lot of tools, these forums, these envoys, all sorts of stuff, but they actually haven't gotten as much as they wanted, right? I mean, a question that often comes up in China studies is the gap between presence and influence, right? I mean, the Chinese can convene meetings, they can send envoys, but if they're not actually doing very much, right? Then, in other words, if the envoys aren't doing very much, and I raise this in the context of the Middle East, when I was at RAND, right before I left RAND in the late 2000s, in 2009, I published this book, China's International Behavior. And what I found was, in terms of the Middle East back then, it's obviously different now, but the Chinese were sort of becoming more active. They had, I think, their first envoy. But on the big questions that Middle Eastern states cared about, so questions like Middle East peace, right? The Israel-Palestine issue, on big issues like the Iranian nuclear issue, right? The Chinese were basically, and Syria, the Chinese were just basically, they weren't silent, but they just, they didn't really contribute much, right? So they had envoys and they did things, but, it wasn't really translating into anybody seeing China as more than an economic actor. Now, of course, fast forward, we're about 15 years from the late 2000s, and we're in an era where obviously Middle Eastern countries are pretty disenfranchised and frustrated with the United States, and they're looking for alternatives. So, the question is it Chinese deft diplomacy that has allowed them to grow their influence, right? Is it the application of all the arrows in their quiver? Or is it changes in regional perceptions and, frankly, challenges, problems in American foreign policy that has created an opening for China? So how has China done in achieving its interests, and how much of what it has achieved is a result of China versus the region changing? Third question for you, Dawn, is about military diplomacy, because your section on military diplomacy is excellent. It talks about China's contribution to PKOs, arms sales, but I feel like there may be a bit more there, and this certainly could be simply a function of book production cycles. But when I look at the Middle East, I look at China establishing a pretty robust defense security cooperation relationship with both the Saudis and the Emiratis. So we're talking about with the Saudis, UAVs, missiles, satellites. I mean, China looks like it's emerging as a very substantial security partner to the Saudis. When it comes to the Emiratis, similarly UAVs, but also there's been a lot of discussion about, China establishing a naval base, with the UAE. So sort of, can you get us up to speed from when the book was published about in the Middle East in particular, but welcome your insights on Africa as well. Is China, now that the Chinese military, the PLA, is bigger, more sophisticated, clearly they have a more advanced force structure. So their product offering when it comes to arms sales and security cooperation has the potential to be a lot more substantial. So are you seeing that? Are you seeing the sort of the military security assistance arrow in the quiver in the Middle East and Africa? Is it becoming, more substantial? Fourth question relates specifically to the Middle East and especially Saudi Arabia, right? And in late 2022, Xi Jinping took this really interesting trip to Saudi Arabia. And just sort of tell us a little bit about what that was about. And it looked to me like it was probably a leading indicator of where China's diplomacy toward the Middle East is going. And in particular, I think part of it was Saudi Arabia looking for, alternatives, or at least to diversify their great power relationships as tensions emerge in the US-Saudi relationship. But what was most interesting to me about the Saudi relationship was not just the energy component, which we know about and that's important, but it looked like the Chinese and the Saudis signed a whole variety of MOUs on issues that are about Saudi Arabia building a non-oil dependent economy, a lot more than that. So is the Chinese product offering to the Middle East, and is there a greater convergence between sort of what Middle Eastern countries want from China and what China is willing to supply, and in particular helping Saudi Arabia, modernize and to build an economy that is not fully oil dependent. So that, I don't know how closely you followed Xi's trip, but that seemed like a particularly important trip, and a trip that might tell us more about China-Middle East relations than just sort of one bilateral meeting. Fourth question is more about Africa and the Middle East, and your view on whether or not those two regions really do see China as a leader of the developing world, right? This is, has long been part of China's self-identity, right? We are the largest developing country, we're the leader of the developing world, and we want to sort of work with you much more closely. And basically, does that resonate, right? Does that message work? Because, from the Chinese perspective, they're the largest developing country, right? In the United States, we say, is China really a developing country anymore? Second largest economy in the world, right? It may soon become a upper income economy, depending on how their economy evolves. So how much traction is China really getting with this leader of the developing world? Or is it really just countries in the Middle East and Africa want to deal with China because it's a large economy, it wants to buy their resources, it wants to invest in them, it's willing to help them through infrastructure investment and other types of investment to develop their market, which of course China can then, sell into. So I'd be curious to see, get your assessment of the connectivity between how those regions see China and China's effort to promote itself. And then I guess the last question is something that you touched on in the book, but you didn't get too much time to address in your presentation, was about comparing China's diplomacy to the Middle East and Africa. What do you see as the major similarities? What do you see as the major differences? When you listed the various Chinese interests toward both regions, it'd be curious to sort of see a breakdown about what are Chinese priorities in protecting their interests in the Middle East versus Africa, and sort of how are they doing, right? I mean, are these, is it, did you find any particular insights from comparing these regions, or, do you think it would make sense to compare other regions, which is sort of my final point, which is just to get you to speculate, Dawn, about Latin America, right? Because that's the one region that's not in here. And, I know that you've looked at this, and I'd be, curious to just get you to sort of riff a little while about what you think China's trying to do in Latin America, how similar it is to the Middle East and Africa, right? Traditionally, we don't think of China as having a robust security cooperation agenda in Latin America. Is that changing? And just a little bit of speculation, trying to draw on the lessons of Middle East and Africa. But again, Dawn, congratulations, wonderful piece of work, really well timed. I hope that you continue to stay on this wicket, because China's relationship with the developing world, to me, is one of the most important dimensions of Chinese foreign policy in this new post-Cold War era that I talked about at the beginning. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Evan, thanks so much. Don, before you